Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the next session of Islamic courses, Zoom conferences we're having every day. Very privileged to have Professor Joseph Lumbard, who's in Qatar at the moment from the Quranic Studies at the College of Islamic Studies at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. The program is hosted by our dear friend Hafiz Abdullah Muhammed from the Quran Study Group, and it's really an insight to the study Quran text. Study Quran text is a book Brother Joseph and the team have actually written under the supervision of Professor Hussein Nasser, which is essentially a text to study the Quran, but more explanation by Brother Yusuf and Hafiz Abdullah. Without further ado, just some housekeeping rules. If you could kindly please put your chat on mute, not chat, the speakers on mute, so there's no number one. And secondly, we are going to have a Q&A session, questions answers. Questions will be done on the chat, and then Professor Joseph will choose whichever questions he wants, and also we will have a chance to have hands raised as well, and you can have direct questions. But again, I'll leave that to our host. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ustad Abdullah. Bismillah.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu. Thank you everyone for joining today's program. We are really delighted to have Professor Joseph Lumbard joining us today to talk about the study Quran, which is quite a unique work in the English language. My own interest is in Quranic studies, and I myself in my own collection, I have around 100 or so complete English translations of the Quran since 1649. And the study Quran is one of the latest translations that have come about in the 21st century. It is very unique in many regards. It is the only and the most extensive original commentary of the Quran in the English language, spanning over just some 2,000 pages. I'm sure the professor will explain in detail why they kept to that limit. Before we go further, I would like to introduce you to the professor. Assalamu alaikum, Professor.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you so much for joining us and taking your time, especially when you have just broken the fast. We really
thank you. It's my honor.
That. So I'm going to say a few words to the audience just about yourself, and then we'll take some questions, inshallah. So Professor Joseph Lumbard is currently an Associate Professor of Quranic Studies at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. He is a translator, commentary author, and general editor for the study Quran. He's also a former advisor for interfaith affairs to King Abdullah II of Jordan, and the author, editor, and translator of several articles and books on topics of Islamic philosophy, Sufism, Quranic studies. Professor Lumbard is a frequent lecturer and has taken part in several interfaith dialogues, among them the Common Word Initiative. After serving as advisor for interfaith affairs, he became director of the Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies program at Brandeis University. Professor Lumbard began his teaching career at the American University in Cairo in 2002, and after receiving a PhD in Islamic Studies from Yale University. So Professor, before we start about the study Quran itself, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You are an American Muslim, but teaching Quranic studies at a university in a Muslim country. Tell us a little bit about your journey, what led you to be there rather than in a conventional Western university where you were previously.
Well, the reason I'm not in a conventional Western university is manifold. I have by accident ended up spending more of my professional life in the Arab world than in the West. That was not my intention. My intention was to live and stay in the United States, but the study Quran did not meet with the approval of the people for whom I was working at Brandeis University, and I was therefore denied tenure. As a result, rather than wasting my energies fighting the process, I decided to return to teach in the Arab world. So there's nothing really intentional about it, but it's where I've ended up being, and it's nice to have been in these different places. I've taught at the American University of Cairo, at the American University in Sharjah, and now at Hamad bin Khalifa University. And it provides an excellent opportunity to really interact with people who come from a very different background and see how the obstacles to a person from my background understanding the Quran and entering into the depths of the Quran and of Islam are have a lot to do with many of the factors that foment Islamophobia. Whereas the barriers that you experience within different parts of the Muslim world have to do with cultural accretions that have developed around the text and around the tradition. I have to say that, I mean, I'm sitting here teaching the Quran, and now I teach in Arabic at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and I still kind of sit back and wonder how that happened. It certainly isn't something that I ever envisioned doing.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. Obviously, you played a significant role in the study Quran, having translated and provided commentary for majority of surahs, surahs 1 and surahs 29 to 114, and you've been also a general editor for the translation of the commentary of the rest of the surahs. So would it be correct to say that you are actually the translator of the English translation itself?
Well, the translation was a group effort. I mean, there is the way that the translation worked was that we had agreed upon principles and agreed upon phrases. I mean, for example, tajri min tahtiha al-anhar. We went through. We would debate how that would occur in each instance, and there's only one instance where it actually has to be translated slightly differently to fit the context. But we went through that. So you would have these phrases, that you would know, alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat, something like that. Those who believe. You're going to say those who believe, those who have faith, those who are believers and perform righteous deeds and do good deeds. What are you going to do? Well, we would have one phrase that was agreed upon. So those factors were agreed upon when you're translating. So those are the easy parts. And then each translator would be responsible for following the principles that we had laid down. And working on their different parts. And then that translator would send it to the other people on the team, and they would go through it. And then we would have meetings online. And sometimes, it's too bad we didn't have Zoom then. It would have been much easier. But we would have these online meetings that would sometimes go on for hours, trying to hash out how we would translate a certain word or a certain phrase, how we would interpret. I have a question here. Does anybody know what the most difficult word to translate in the entire Quran is? Musharraf Hussain is here, so he might have an idea. The most difficult word to translate in the entire Quran is wa. You think you've got it down. You'd think you would know. But in the Arabic language, it's used 27 different ways in the Arabic language. And how you're going to interpret that in each instance and go through the debates, and then how you can translate it. So we had a lot of debates about terms, and then we also had a team of graduate research assistants that would kind of go through and look for some of the inconsistencies and some of the ways in which we might have mistranslated a phrase or not fully captured the depth of a particular word, and provide lists for us that we would then use. But everybody went through that. So when you look at the translation, it really is something that everybody on the team had as much input into each section.
Okay. The translation of the study Quran, was a labor of love. And I remember I saw a post on Facebook you posted some time ago where you compared to the birth of your daughter, and it took like 10 years or so, how she was growing, and this is how long it took for the study Quran to come into existence. So can you tell us a little bit about why and how the study Quran came into existence following HarperCollins approaching Professor Hussein Nasr?
Well, so HarperCollins had this idea, you know, there are many study Bibles out there. And the study Bible is a particular genre of Bible text, which, you know, the idea is that you'll have a single volume that you can kind of have a quick glance at to the meaning of a particular verse, or understanding the historical context of particular verses of the Quran, and then, or sorry, of the Bible here, and then continue to read on. And HarperCollins had done the first study Bible. And after that, other people started doing this. So now you have study Bibles of all different genres: the Orthodox study Bible, the Catholic study Bible, the Evangelical study Bible, the this study Bible, the that study Bible, everything that you can imagine. And some things you can't. So anyways, HarperCollins had the idea that they should do a study Quran. And they had done a few books with Dr. Nasr, and so they approached him. And Dr. Nasr said, well, I'm not a scholar of Quranic studies, so I'm not really the person to do this. And he just left it at that. And then they came back to him, and they said, no, we'd really like you to do this. And again, he said, I'm not a scholar of Quranic studies. And then they came to him and they said, well, we're going to do this. And at that moment, he realized that if they took this idea that they had and they turned it over to some team of scholars of the Quran, but who had some animus towards the Quran, as is unfortunately frequent within the field, or not frequent, but exists within the field, that what would end up happening was that there would be deep misrepresentations of the Quran in the first ever study Quran published by a Western press. And he basically said that there's a friend of his who said to him, look, you know, if you don't do this and somebody else does a bad job, you're going to have to answer for that when you stand before your Lord. And so he said, okay. He called up HarperCollins and said, yeah, I'll do this. But he gave them some conditions. And one of the conditions was that he had absolute control over the text, and they could not, you know, make any changes. And he had absolute control over all contributors. And he said to them flat out at the time that all contributors would be Muslims.
That is a really moving account, Professor, especially given the fact that if Professor Hussein Nasr didn't take up the project, and if he went to some other people, especially we know in the field of Quranic studies, we have these revisionists, for example, still lingering around with weird theories about the Quran, and they're not even sure whether the Quran existed and things like that. So the fact that he could have easily went to groups of people like that. So in some way, it was a great rescue operation, serving the Ummah to that Professor Hussein and your team undertook that project. So despite some of the criticism amongst some quarters, they must realize the context in which this whole thing came about. So can you tell us a little bit about the methodology adopted by the study Quran?
Well, that's a good question. Now, if you are to go through the commentary, so I've told you a little bit about the translation methodology. We could get more into that, but I don't want to bore everybody because I think Musharraf Hussain is the only person who would really be deeply interested in that, and maybe yourself with your study of translations. But the process of the commentary, that again was one of, well, which commentaries are we going to use? Where are we going to draw the line? Because you have, I mean, hundreds of commentaries out there, and should we focus on a particular school of thought or not? Should we draw some lines there? And you know, again, people will be surprised that if you look, for example, between Shia and Sunni commentary, there's really, you know, for the vast majority, like the major Shia commentaries, like At-Tabarsi and At-Tusi, that it's really, you know, 85% the same or even more as Sunni commentaries. So there's a lot of overlap there. But we wanted all major schools of Islamic thought to be represented. And we kind of made a cutoff when it comes to not the modern period, because we have, for example, a Shawkani who's technically in the modern period, though I wouldn't call his tafsir modern. and the Tabatabai, who's technically in the modern period. Al-Alusi is technically in the early modern period as well. Even Ibn Ajiba, we would say, is in the early modern period. But they're not, are tafsirs written in the classical style. And we wanted to maintain that. And part of the reason is because being aware that this is going to be the first edition like this in English, we didn't want to overrepresent trends that are in vogue in the contemporary period. And so one of the things that is in vogue is sometimes people are more inclined to look at the political implications of particular verses. This is not to say that people did not do it in the past, but it is one of the ways in which verses are discussed more frequently now, and people relate it to particular issues that we have now. So we wanted to in a sense remain with those things which have had staying power over time and are therefore going to remain representative of parts of the classical Islamic tradition. Now, some of the things that we thus left out may indeed end up being parts that are incorporated into the tradition and viewed 150 years, 200 years from now as an important part of the tradition, but we don't know that right now. And so we stayed with those things which we know have, in a sense, shall we say, stood the test of time.
Okay, thank you for that. Can we go on the issue about the team selected by Professor Nasser for the study Quran? So how did he decide on the team?
Well, the team had a lot to do with who was willing to make the sacrifice. And there's quite a few people, not that many people, there's several people that we approached who weren't willing to make the sacrifice to be involved in this project. And the first person that Dr. Nasser spoke to was myself. And Dr. Nasser asked me to help him assemble a team. One of the things that I very much wanted to do was to have a team that was, have the people who were working on the text for it to be an equal gender divide. We didn't get that, but we tried. But there's only so many times that you can ask various scholars, and several people turned us down. But the first person that we got was Maria Daycake. And in part also because Maria is a specialist, particularly in early Shiism, and that's an area where I don't know. And so Dr. Nass, while also knowledgeable in that area, he wasn't going to be writing the commentary himself. So it was important to have somebody who we could get for, to bounce things off and say, is this actually representative? So we got Maria Daycake, and then Janeer Dale. And there were a few other people that we thought about and we asked, and they turned us down. And then we started working on it. And the first thing that we had to do was to identify which translation we were going to use. When we went into this, we thought we were going to use an existing translation. And we went through the existing translations. And as we went through them, even ones that I had some affinity for over time, we realized that none of them would really suffice as the backdrop for a study text. And there are two reasons. One is inaccuracies. One thing that people who have studied Quran translations will have noticed is that a lot of translators get their mansubat mixed up. That is things that are in I won't go into a detailed grammatical lesson here, but things that are in the mansub. So people get, maf'ul li ajlihi mixed up with maf'ul bihi and things like that. And then you're sitting there, people read a hal as a tamyiz, and then you're sitting there with a very bad translation or a misrepresentation of the text. So you have accuracy. Then you also have to have simplicity. Now, what I mean by simplicity is there are some translations out there that if you were to pick them up, you'd think, well, you know, this poor Lord of the Worlds, he really needs human beings to put brackets in between his words in order for it to make any sense. Astaghfirullah. I mean, there are people who are putting in, you know, you've got, you know, praise be to God, and then in brackets, who is one, the Lord of the worlds, there is no other, but he do not associate any other with him, end of bracket. You're like, oh my God, this is like, it is the most inelegant text you could imagine. And then also consistency. Consistency, if you're going to do a study text, you absolutely need to look for consistency throughout, because you're going to have to be cross-referencing back and forth over and over throughout the volume. So if you're doing a translation, just a translation, then sometimes the modifications that you have of words or phrases to meet a particular context, you can be a little bit looser. But if you're building something that's going to be the backdrop of a commentary, you need to be able to refer directly back to that when discussing another verse, and have the reader be able to see the association that you're making in the commentary. So that type of consistency is something in which the vast majority of translations are sorely lacking.
Okay.
So we then went about and we decided, well, we got to translate this book. And that took us several years. So this whole project was not supposed to take 10 years. But once we decided to translate the book, we tacked on at least 2 years there, and probably more. And then there came the point of writing the commentary. For the commentary, originally much of our idea was to do it the way that many of the commentaries or the study notes for study Bibles are done, where you get X scholar from University Y to come in and write the notes for Surah Al-Baqarah, another scholar to do the notes for Surah Al-Imran, another scholar for Surah An-Nisa, et cetera, on down the line. We realized after a while that due to the, due to the new nature, the innovative nature of the text, that wasn't really going to work. Because we actually asked people, we drew up a list of people that we would ask. We'd begun discussions with a few of them, and it was clear from some of the discussions that even if we gave people a set of guidelines, they weren't going to be so happy to follow it. They were going to kind of do what they wanted to do. And so you'd end up reading the commentary on Surah Al-Baqarah by a scholar who is more embedded in law, and he isn't going to go and look at what some of the Sufi texts, for example, say about something, or what some philosophical texts say, philosophical tafseers like Ar-Razi have to say about something, and they miss some of the theological depth of the surah. And then you move on to Surah Al-Imran, and you hand it over to a scholar whose specialty is philosophy and Sufism, and all of a sudden it's going to be like you're reading a completely different study Quran. That is not something that we wanted for this book. And there were other people who asked us other questions. We just said this is going to not work to create a unified text. And it's at that point that we decided that we would all do it. And we got a grant that allowed us to take the time to be able to do it. And that was kind of the key to be able to move forward and have us write the text, myself, Maria Dekek, and Janer Dale. And then we brought in Muhammad Rostam at a later time to, so that's why he's listed there as an assistant editor. But he actually went through, he did a great job. He went through and he reviewed the entire translation for us when he came on board, and noticed a lot of things that we had missed, that some of the graduate assistants had missed, and really helped us kind of firm up the project in many ways.
Professor, the study Quran, in my view, is the most extensive commentary of the Quran in English originally, although we have translations of commentaries in English from other languages, but it's the most original commentary in the English language. Nevertheless, you still don't describe the study Quran as a tafsir. Why is it so?
You know, it's hard to say. I mean, because, so a tafsir, all right, so you could say it's a tafsir. right? I mean, I guess, one might want to say it, but why would I say that it's not technically a tafsir? If you want to see why it's not technically a tafsir, read Walid Saleh's essay on tafsir at the end of the study Quran. Because there are interpretations in there which I don't just disagree with, but I find repugnant, astaghfirullah. But they're part of the tradition, and they've been a deep and part of the tradition. And most tafsir, not all, but most tafsir are written with a particular school in mind. So that is to back up, to be kind of the undergirding for a particular theological position within the tradition, or for a new understanding of that theological position. So Ash'arism is well established at the time that Fakhruddin Razi writes his tafsir. Fakhruddin Razi does have some positions within Ash'arism that had not been present in earlier modes of Ash'arism, such as the understanding of the soul that had transformed in Ash'arism by that time. And so so his tafsir is kind of undergirding a lot of those changes. And so, and Ibn Kathir marks kind of a change that you have in the kind of the school of Ibn Taymiyyah and such. But we don't see ourselves as within this advocating the Sunni position, advocating a Mu'tazilite position, advocating an Ash'ari position, advocating a 12er Imam position. And so, but they are all present. So you go to for example, the discussion that you would have on Qadr, divine will. We've got every perspective in there. And none of them are necessarily ones that would be of a school that, I wrote that commentary, so none of them would be from a school that I identify with. I just put in, you may say, a representation of the debate. And that is why I would say that it is, if you want to call it a tafsir, well, you have to qualify it and say how it does differ in form and in intent and in content from previous tafsirs. But if you go through the history of tafsir, I mean, that happens all the time. There was huge debates about whether Abdul Rahman as-Sulami's Haqa'iq al-Tafsir was a tafsir. You go back to Atha'labi, and people said of Atha'labi, they said that his tafsir is like a blind man walking around on a moonless night collecting firewood. And so like there's meaning he threw in everything without any discernment. And some people would probably say that about the study Quran as well. So what is tafsir has always been debated and will always be debated.
Okay, thank you for that. So in some ways, the study Quran is unique, that it is an eclectic tafsir. So it's got everything, like what was said about Imam Razi's tafsir. It has everything and tafsir. So it's got things from different schools of thought, rather than advocating one particular position, as he explained. However, would you not agree, Professor, that every translation and every commentary, there is bound to be personal and ideological bias? And the fact that the team that have edited the study Quran, you are all aligned to Professor Hossein Nasr. So there's bound to be some sort of an ideological affiliation to his methodology and school of thought. And then then that is bound to then come across through the study Quran. So how would you address that?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I will tell you quite honestly that I've never said this in public, but I guess we've gone long enough that I can say it now. There were times when Dr. Nasser, I mean, he didn't write any of the commentary, first of all. There were times when Dr. Nasser made edits and put something in, and we would actually have a discussion and say, well, first of all, like that doesn't really necessarily coincide with this verse, and secondly, it's not in tafsirs. How are we supposed to attribute that? It doesn't fit the style that we're doing. And for myself, I just chose not to put it in. I mean, it was just so. I mean, you have to identify the particular places where you're making that charge. And I mean, the hilarious thing is that people have actually tried to identify places where they were making the claim that we were being, shall we say, perennialist or universalist, pluralistic or too pluralistic in the study Quran. And the hilarious thing is, like, you see this in review and somebody's like, as when they say this, and oh my God, the passage that the person is citing was quoted by, and I'm particularly bringing this up because somebody went into parts where Maria Daycake did this, and she said, some take the position that X, Y, Z, all right? And she said, however, that does not match with the dhahir meaning, with the actual literal meaning of this verse. And they only quote the part where she says, some say that, and she didn't even put the some say. They just put da-da-da-da. Like, okay, let's say, she didn't say this, but let's say, everyone can therefore be saved. Everyone is therefore necessarily saved, right? Some say that. She would say, some say that, but that is not what the Quranic text says. And literally, you find people were making this claim. And so what unfortunately happened is that people were of the opinion that because Dr. Nasser has positions with which they do not agree, that they were going to find all of these within the study Quran commentary. And, people don't agree with, for example, how 262 was treated. Now, that's the famous verse that is debated about whether or not it's universalist, etc. Those who believe, those who are Christians, the Jews and the Sabians, they are those who believe and perform righteous deeds. They shall have their reward with their Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they sorrow. They shall have their reward with their Lord, right? So does this mean everyone? So there's a lot of people who want to read that as a completely universalist reading. Well, there's a reason that Janer Dale took 3 pages of the study Quran to discuss that. And that's because it is such a controversial verse, and to show that there has been a plethora of ways in which this particular verse has been understood over time. And whichever your position is, well, there's a backup for that somewhere within the tradition. Not for a fully universalist, reading which says everybody, that all of these people who practice any religion are saved. That I don't think is anywhere in the Quran. But people thought that that's what we were going to say. And so a lot of people went into things. I mean, a funny thing happened. For example, somebody was saying, oh, look, they did this in the study Quran. And then Janer Dale tweeted back to that person, actually, that's not what the passage says. Here's what it says. And the person blocked Janer Dale. Another person went out and started saying, oh, it says this, it says this, it says this. And a friend of mine went to that person and said, we should probably get together and talk about this. I mean, this isn't productive. This isn't a useful thing for us to be exercising in social media. Why don't you come over to my house? And this other person says, no, I want a public debate. I mean, I don't know what Islam that is, personally. And I don't know in what Islam you take the words out of a text and you misrepresent them in order to build an argument against them. I have had lots of communications with people who have pointed out mistakes. I had one scholar who sent me 5 pages of notes on places where he thought that the translation had done a slight mistake, where it had been inconsistent, where one of the mansubat had been misread, and places in the commentary where he thought there were inconsistencies. And we went to Harper and we put about 30% of the comments that he sent us are in the later printings of the study Quran. I've had other people, like Joe Bradford, sent me some notes about some particular places where he found something that he thought was incorrect, and I had a discussion with him about them. That is something that we have been open to the whole time.
I agree with that last point, Professor, because I remember in one of the Facebook comments privately, I raised one of the issues about one of the passages, and you had no hesitation whatsoever but to confirm that. So that is something very positive to note. But coming back to my previous issue, would you agree that every translation and commentary is not free of personal and ideological bias? And
Absolutely.
If so, you can see some of that from the background of the study Quran editors in the study Quran.
Look, we're human beings. It's impossible. the definition of being human is to come from a limited perspective. We try, and part of being a scholar is to try as much as you can to challenge your perspective and to come up with what is as accurate as you can represent given the materials to which you have access. And check yourself constantly. But this is something that we're aware of. I mean, so we might have a list of particular opinions regarding a particular verse. The order in which we chose to list those opinions comes down to a human being. The way in which we phrased the connections between some of those might reflect some of our particular biases. And this is one of the things that, ultimately, no matter what, when you're choosing data and you're choosing from all of these different tafsir that are out there, you are making your own choice and writing your own text. And there are times when for space, because we only had one single volume, where you got to kind of to take all of these different things that are being said by Zamakhshari, Tabari, Ibn Kathir, Qurtubi, Fakhruddin al-Razi. You really have to try to boil it all down into 2 sentences. And at that point, you can't provide a citation because this is your condensation of the material. You've digested the material and now come up with this particular interpretation. So, but you can't do that. But at the same time, you don't want to say, this is my thought, this is my idea. So it's very difficult in that regard. And yes, there are places and, there are probably mistakes in there that I still haven't realized.
Okay, thank you for that. You alluded to previously. Can you tell us what is perennialism, and is the study Quran marked by perennialist thought?
I don't know what perennialism is. You tell me.
Professor Hossein Nasr is renowned for his perennialist thoughts, following the school of thought of Scorn. So are some of those thoughts coming through the study Quran? Because that's one of the common charges leveled against the study Quran.
I know, but again, see, this is the trick. All right, I have to say, I have had this conversation. I basically about every other month or so, somebody comes and says, you're a perennialist. They contact me on social media or email something. I say, well, what's a perennialist? And they say, I don't know, what is it? Or you tell me, and then tell me why you're not this. And I'm like, okay, so you're bringing an accusation against me. And so now you want me to define the term of which you are accusing me and then defend myself. I mean, excuse me, I've had scholars do this to me. I'm like, oh my God, if this is our level of discourse, we're lost. And so the problem with perennialism is that there are multiple different people who identify with the perennial philosophy. Now, the basic idea, if you might say that all perennialists share in common, is that there is one truth which is expressed in multiple different ways in various traditions. Some of them will say it's just religious traditions, and some of them will say that it is religious and philosophical traditions. But at the heart of it is a belief that all human beings have an access to this particular truth. Now, where you start getting into problems, I personally think that from an Islamic perspective, there's no problem with that we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made, every valid religion has been revealed by God, and that it has ultimately the same source. Now, when you start getting into when religions remain valid, at what point do particular religions cease to be valid, what do we mean by that? Do we mean only the Abrahamic faiths, or do we mean faiths beyond that? If we mean faiths beyond that, at what point in their history did those faiths cease to be true representations of the particular texts that are at the heart of that, or the particular revelation that is at the heart of that? And then the other big issue is salvific efficacy. Does salvific efficacy remain within those traditions? And that, you know, I mean, I personally think that this is one of the things that when, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about this, you know, for example, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, in the famous verse of verse 48 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, you know, when it says that we have brought down this book bil-haq, and that it is musaddiqan lima bayna yadayh, that it confirms that which came before it, wa muhaymin alayh, as kind of almost protecting over it. And then it goes on to say, you know, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given everybody, you know, shara'i, that is different laws, and minhaj, and then also in Surah 21, Surah Al-Hajj, when it says that they've got, that people have different manasik. So there's a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent different ways of recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in different religions. But then at the end of that verse in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ فِيهِ تَخْتَلِفُونَ. All right, we're going to inform you of that wherein you differ. And before that it says, فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, you know, إِلَى اللَّهِ مَرْجِعُكُمْ. So compete with one another in good deeds. All right, don't debate. Now, that's part of the thing is just compete in good deeds. Which one of you can do better deeds than the other? All right, which one of you is going to actually do good deeds? This is really what it comes down to. And then, when all is said and done, God's going to inform you of that wherein you differ. So stick to your way and have your opinions regarding other traditions. But guess what? When it comes to the efficacy of other traditions, it's beyond our pay grade for the most part. As human beings, this isn't something we're going to understand. Now, there is, of course, the idea in the Quran, and it's replete in the Hadith, that people of different traditions have ceased to follow their traditions, have ceased to recite the books properly, that they have done tahrif, that they have changed the books in actual wording, and that they have changed the books in their interpretation of them. And what does that mean? Frankly, you know, what does that mean for their final ends? Well, from an Islamic perspective, it's not good. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all forgiving, all merciful, and where people will end up in the end, that's not something that we know. Our job is to stick to our tradition as best we can and follow it and help other people to follow it. That's not a straightforward answer to your question, but I think that when it gets to, you know, what is perennialism, I have actually come to the point where I think I need to write an essay, perennialism, what it is and what it is not. I mean, because people have to understand that if you're going to talk about, for example, Sayyid Hussein Nasser has some differences from Guénon and Chouan, and Lings has some significant differences from Chouan as regards his understanding of the Christian tradition. And then I myself, I wouldn't really call myself a perennialist. I would say that I'm somebody who believes in covenantal pluralism, meaning that there is a pre-eternal covenant that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made with all human beings. It's referred to in 7:172 of the Quran when Allah said, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And all humanity answered, Bala. And that's a covenant of an eternal covenant between God and human beings. And then every tradition that is sent down has been sent down over time so that human beings can live in accord with that covenant on this plane of existence. But those different dispensations are manifestations of, you might say, a temporal manifestation to help us live in accord with the pre-temporal covenant. And our job is to do that as best as we can.
Okay, just on a side point on the same issue, the Orthodox Muslim position, articulated both in the Sunni and the Shia tradition, is that God sent prophets and messengers to all the nations, but over time they were corrupted and further revelation had to come, further scriptures had to come to reaffirm the original message. So the Orthodox Muslim position is, after the revelation of the Quran, that is the ultimate truth. So the previous religions or the forms of the religion are no longer the pure, unadulterated message. So people ought to now accept the message of the Quran for salvation. Is this the position taken by the editors of the Study Quran whilst doing the commentary on the Quran?
You know, I can't speak for the other. There's a video on YouTube where Janer Dale talks about perennialism in the Quran, and you could go to that to get his position, what he believes. You know, I for my part, I mean, if you want to know my position, I was a Christian and I converted to Islam. That should speak for itself.
Yes, I can testify that, Professor, because 4 years ago when we met, we prayed together in Jamaat in the House of Commons. Alhamdulillah. And
Alhamdulillah.
that is good. So now let's go to the translation of the study Quran itself. So can you tell us in the translation why you did not adopt modern English, which is the feature of Quran translations from the middle of the 20th century, from the time of the Penguin Classics translation by N.J. Dawood, and almost every other translation after that has adopted contemporary English as the norm for English translation Quran, whereas you went back to the classic style of like Yusuf Ali and Pickthall. So why have you done so?
You know, there are multiple reasons. Okay, now one, I have to say that, like, so my father was an English literature major. My mother was an English literature major. I was an English literature major and a religious studies major. All right, so I mean, literally, my father would be cooking eggs in the morning, reciting Yeats and Keats. So you know, I grew up with that style of English not being foreign to me. And I think that personally that might have complicated my judgment in this issue. Maria Daycake was very much against our using this at the beginning. And I guess, you know, Dr. Nasser inclined more towards the early modern English is what we technically call the King James style. So that ended up winning out, myself and Dr. Nasser being the strongest advocates of it, and Janer Dale kind of agreeing with us. But there's another issue there, which is there's multiple issues. So I look for three things in a Quran translation. I look for accuracy, consistency, and eloquence. I still think that that those translations that used an older kind of King James style are more eloquent. But part of it has to do with the fact that some of the people who translated that were I think more deeply educated in English. In Arbery's style, there are certain places where Arbery captures phrases in a way that conveys this kind of vaunted simplicity of the Arabic of the Quran that other translations don't do effectively. And so we hoped to capture some of that. Now, if you are reading the Quran and you are an Arab, even if you are a non-Muslim Arab, you say this book is different. This is a different use of the language. When you hear Shakespearean English, you say this is different. You know, and there are a lot of people. I mean, still, the King James version of the Bible is actually still the best-selling version of the Bible. At least it was last time I checked 5 years ago. And there's a lot of people for whom, if it's not King James, it's not the Bible. And so it's like, you know, if they hear a psalm in one of these modern translations, they just say, oh my God, that's not the Bible. And so there's something of that register that we wanted to hit. The other thing is that with thee and thou, I think that the issue of iltifat in the Quran, of switching particularly between the second person plural and the second person singular, I think that you have to capture that in the Quran in order to effectively translate the Quran. For English, the best way to do that in an immediate spoken style is by using thee and thou. In a written style, maybe it's to have a color-coded text, to put you in blue whenever it's in the singular, for example. and keep it in black whenever it's in the plural, and capitalize it whenever it refers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That might have been a better way. And now when I look at it, I think that if I had to do it over again, I might change. I might advocate for going with, you might say, more of a Walt Whitman style of English, a more late modern English, and then use the color-coded text. The reason being, one of the things that I personally did not think of in doing this is that the Anglophone audience in Islam has a lot of people for whom English is a second language, and whose fathers were not reciting Yeats and Keats at the breakfast table. I mean, my father had memorized, dozens of Shakespearean sonnets, and he would recite them. So these are the types of things that resonate in my ears. But for people for whom English is a second language, especially those who acquire it later in life, that thee and thou and ist and dust, those can really be a barrier to the text, and I hadn't fully taken account of that.
Okay, Professor, one of the latest trends in Quran translation is to translate the Quran in plain English to make it accessible to the people. After all, Quran is meant to be a guide for the people. So if I understand what you're saying about preserving the classical style, but the Quran is not designed to be a classic text in the sense that it's a work of literature to be analyzed. It's meant to be a book of guidance. So what didn't you say is a disservice rather, because you acknowledge a lot of the Muslims are second, English is not their first language. So you're already putting a barrier in them accessing the translation. So what do you say about this trend of translation of the Quran going in the form of plain English?
Alhamdulillah. That's what I say. I mean, I think that we should have multiple different translations. I think that one of the things is that, once you're translating the Quran, it's not the Quran. It's that simple. And and so to have multiple different translations out there is useful. And there are different communities who are going to relate to the text differently. People of different education levels, people of different competencies in English, and to have different translations available is extremely useful.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Every translator of the Quran has a target audience in mind. So for the study Quran, it will be academics, scholars, and students. So, and you have adopted a more literal translation of the Quran, whereas the focus of people who are doing more idiomatic translations, more the translation in simpler English, they tend to go for more idiomatic translations. So would you advocate an idiomatic translation?
I think that an idiomatic translation can work. It leads to, it can lead to some grave inconsistencies, or shall we say significant inconsistencies. I think grave might be, that's an interpretive word, but significant inconsistencies in the text and in how people understand it. So sometimes you can't get some of that cross-referencing. I mean, for people who read the Quran every single day, people who read a juz every day or more, one of the things that ends up happening as you continually read the Quran is you start making associations. And then you go, oh my, I never saw that. You realize how a turn of phrase in one verse is mirroring a turn of phrase in another verse. You realize that the way in which, shukr, gratitude, is used in one place is mirrored in another place. I mean, when the Quran says that it implies that people are being thanked for their deeds, mashkur, I mean, that's like absolutely amazing, but some translations don't capture that at all. So these are the types of things that I don't incline to it personally, but again, that's because I have this deep I don't want to say deep, but extensive experience of reading the Quran every day. I mean, it's almost accidental, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed me with being in the position where every day I have to read people's papers about the Quran, or I have to prepare lectures about the Quran. So I'm constantly interacting with the text. And so I'm constantly seeing these cross-textual relations, and I want them to be present in a translation. But I do see how an idiomatic representation of the text might help people get more into the immediate sense of particular verses.
Okay, thank you, Professor. In terms of the layout of the study Quran translation itself, to be honest with you, myself, even though I have so many translations, I'm more in favor of the commentary bit rather than the translation. One of the main reasons being a student of Professor Abdul Halim, one of the annoyance he has shown in some of the translations of the Quran is that whereas in Arabic text of the Quran, you have one whole single page without any formatting or anything like that. When you put the same in English, it's quite difficult to follow. So I understand you have to cram so much text in 2,000 pages. So because of that, you couldn't put in the Arabic. But to put a continuous narrative in English without any paragraphing, maybe even some subheadings, makes it quite difficult to follow. Would you not accept that?
I would accept that, but I would say the same thing comes when you're reading Surah Al-Baqarah. I mean, if you're picking up Surah Al-Baqarah in the Arabic for the first time and you haven't read through this, it's just one continuous text. You know, this is, I mean, it just goes and it goes. So, whoa, dude, wait, they just changed topics and there's no paragraph break. What just happened there? You know, paragraphs are a modern invention. And I mean, the Bible didn't have paragraphs. Even the verses in the Bible were added later. So this whole way in which we conceptualize things in paragraphs, maybe it works for our modern minds. But the other thing is that when you don't have the paragraph breaks, you are more able to see where different ideas might stop and start. That maybe you should make the paragraph break here, maybe you should make it there. I mean, anybody who's written here knows that when you're kind of doing your final edit, you're like, maybe that should be one paragraph, or should I split that into two paragraphs? Or maybe that paragraph should start with that sentence instead of that sentence. And then you switch it around. So when you're doing that, you know, you are adding a lot of interpretation. And this is, so one of the reasons I don't like brackets is because it starts to limit the interpretation of the Quranic text. I mean, this is what I think is one of the most important things in a Quran translation, is to try to allow the language into which you have translated, the target language, to reflect as much of the polyvalent nature. That is the way in which the Quran is open to multiple different interpretations within it, within the translation. Right? And once you've started to break it into paragraphs, you've lost some of that. And once you've started to insert brackets, you've started to lose some more of that. Not always, not with every bracket. There's some places where you need a bracket or you need an insertion of some kind. But those things, they start to limit the text and thus limit that personal dimension of the interaction with the book.
Okay, so basically it's forcing the reader to engage with the text, making sense of it themselves rather than helping them, because sometimes you find trends in modern translations, sometimes you have subheadings which automatically already puts the translator's bias in there, because they may think a verse is about an issue, whereas someone else might think that verse is about a completely different issue. So I can understand exactly where you are coming from.
Proclivities. I don't want to say that I wouldn't want to be in a situation where I said that Professor Abdul Halim has bias. He has proclivities. And, you know, I mean, I love Professor Abdul Halim. I don't recommend his translation. I don't like it, personally. But I find it too inconsistent. But that's for me in a lot of ways. A lot of people love that translation. So alhamdulillah for them. Alhamdulillah. He's provided a wonderful service.
Alhamdulillah. Talking about the the three things you were saying earlier about looking for in a good translation. So other than the Study Quran translation, which translation would you recommend, which has those features that you mentioned previously?
Well, one thing I want to say is I haven't actually, I mean, I actually have a video on YouTube in which I discuss Quran translations. Like, for example, I haven't read Musharraf Hussein's translation. When was it published? 2 years ago. All right. I haven't read it yet, so I don't know. So for somebody who wants the Quran in a kind of more accessible, immediate English and wants paragraph breaks to give them some guidance, you know, Abdullah Halim's translation is good. It's not what I incline to. In terms of contemporary English translations, I find the most internally consistent and accurate one to be the one of Ali Quli Qara'i. And there are notes. He's Shia, and there are notes that have discussions of Shia thought sometimes in it. But the translation itself does not, to my mind, reflect anything that is not in the Quranic text. So that's like for immediate accuracy and consistency. I don't necessarily like the English style that much. I find it flat in places. For English style, to read something that really has this kind of eloquence, that reflects the eloquence of the Quran, I still incline towards the translation of A.J. Arbery. I like Arbery more than Pickthall because I find that Pickthall was far less consistent than Arbery. But I haven't done an analytical study where I would be able to fully substantiate that. But those are the two translations to which I personally incline. And I do think that in terms of hitting all three aspects, eloquence, consistency, and accuracy, I do think that the Study Quran would rank in the top 5.
Thank you, Professor. My last question to you. Are there plans, number one, to publish the 15 essays that are included in the Study Quran as a separate book, number one? And number two, are there plans to publish a revised version of the Study Quran, perhaps multi-volume, where you incorporate the Arabic text? Because it's quite difficult for Muslims who read the Quran daily basis to follow it without the Arabic text, and it will be more inconsistent with the spirit of the Study Quran when you're trying to analyze the text directly. So do you have plans to have that addition?
Yeah, this is where you get, people have asked why one volume, etc. Well, because one volume is simple. I mean, remember, this is done with HarperCollins. HarperCollins is a major publisher. This had to be done with a major publisher. Why? Because major publishers are the ones who have $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 to put behind a book. I mean, those maps at the back cost money. Printing those maps cost money. Getting a top-notch copy editor to go through the entire thing. I mean, they had an amazing copy editor. My hat's off to that copy editor. Getting a top-notch editor to go through that entire thing, that cost a lot of money. And then other things that they put down for over time. I mean, it was their money that we were using to pay for research assistants for part of the time. So these things cost money. And you know, commercial presses don't want to publish things in 2 volumes because they know that they don't sell well. It's a whole lot. It's very difficult to market something like that. So unfortunately, you are not going to see a 2-volume edition of the Study Quran. You might see just the translation published. You might see the translation with the Arabic published. We have discussed that with the publisher. But you got to understand there's the other aspect of the publisher. They're kind of like, well, I mean, it's still selling pretty well. Why do we want to create our own competition? Unfortunately, those are issues that come to play. I personally would really like to see it. What I would advocate for is eliminate the essays and create the space, and then use that space created by eliminating the essays to add the Arabic text into the volume, and do it 3 text fields with Arabic at the top, translation underneath, and commentary below.
I will definitely agree with that, Professor, because even Dawood, N.J. Dawood, and also the second edition of Professor Abdul Halim's translation, they, after having English only, they had added the Arabic.
Yep.
So it is going with the trend, you know.
Yeah.
So we will really encourage you to push the publishers for that edition.
Well, you see, it's really hard because they've got the biblical audience in mind. I mean, they don't understand. I mean, the biblical audience, you know, if you go to a major university, and this is Bart Ehrman said this, that he has, like, he gives people a quiz his first day of class at University of North Carolina. And there are people who actually believe in the, you know, that the Bible was written in English. I mean, for us, this is like, no, it's Quran is Arabic. Everything else is interpretation, translation, that's human involvement. The Quran is what's in Arabic. The fact that Muslims all across the globe, from Indonesia to Mauritania to China to the United States and everywhere in between, are like, no, only the Arabic is the Quran, and I want to learn Arabic. They don't get that. That's just that's completely foreign to their mindset. So I don't know if we'll ever get it, but we've tried, and we will continue to try, inshallah.
Before we take up questions from the audience, can you tell us a little bit about your new podcast, The Quran for All Seasons?
Oh,
They're
yeah.
quite illuminating.
Yeah, I actually heard some podcasts on the Quran, and I didn't think they were very good. And I also think that, unfortunately, a lot of Muslims have a tendency to put some stuff out there that doesn't have a high production value. I think it's one of the best things about the study Quran is every aspect of it is cared for. The art, Janeer Dali did the art, and he did an amazing job. You know, from the cover to even the way the index is designed, to the maps in the back, there's thought put into every detail of the presentation. And one of the things that I want to do with Quran for All Seasons is give people a way to engage with the Quran in an elegant format that helps them to take a deeper dive into the meaning of particular verses, and into particular surahs, and really respects all dimensions of the Quran and of the classical tradition, and helps people from every walk of Islam and for non-Muslims to think more deeply and tadabbur of the Quran. And it's on all podcasting networks if anybody is interested.
And if you happen to be on Facebook, you can go to the Professor's Facebook page, or even my page. You'll find links to that, inshallah. If we can take some questions from the audience. So we've got some already there. So one question I have. Thank you, Professor, for the opportunity. Can you explain why is it difficult to get women scholars to contribute to Quran projects? Is it because they are not known in the mainstream?
It's because I don't know. I mean, I don't actually think it's that difficult. It's not difficult in general, but in our situation, one of the things that you do have with getting female scholars to participate in projects is that we are currently at a point where people realize that there has been a lack of representation of female scholars in particular fields. And there remains some biases where people will refer to a woman who has spent 20 years studying at the feet of shuyukh as sister, and a guy who spent a summer in Yemen as sheikh. And that's a problem. But you know, the issue there is that, you know, you don't have as many female scholars, and that's part of a result of some of the biases of the system. And while we're trying to even the balance out so that we are citing female scholars more, so that we are having equal representation on panels and in publications, that means that we are putting a greater demand on the female scholars that are currently in the field while we're trying to do that. And so they end up, as a result, having to say more to more requests in order to keep a manageable workload. And all of us, all scholars, have to say no to multiple requests. But due to the fact that while we're trying to equal those balances, we're going to put more demand on a smaller group of people with PhDs, that's going to be the nature of it. I personally, there are several women that we spoke to that I would have loved to have had involved, and all of them had very legitimate reasons for not being able to make the commitment.
Okay, another question is, how many editions of the study Quran have you had to date, and what were the later changes made?
Oh, I mean, what are the later changes? I can't go through all of them specifically, but there are. I mean, some of it is just a comma was inserted, and some of them. I mean, I noticed one place where we actually had somehow he became we, and that had to be changed, and that was because that was in the translation of the text itself. So changes like that were made in a few places where a repeating phrase of the Quran had actually not been translated in a consistent manner. We went through and we made sure it was consistent. There are little changes like that.
So how would you know which is the latest
in the commentary,
edition?
the ayah number was wrong, and we changed the ayah number, things like that.
So when was the latest edition, and where will we get it?
The last time I sent them changes was 2 years ago.
Well, questions from Rizwan. There's quite a few questions from Rizwan.
All right, let's let Rizwan. Okay, so should I read through these here? I haven't looked at this. There's been a lot on.
Okay, so there's a question from Rizwan. How much time was devoted to the translation itself, and how much to the commentary?
I would say it's probably a 2-to-1 ratio overall. But you've got to realize that as we're writing the commentary, we would go through and realize that there were things about the translation that weren't accurate. So you do the translation, and then you dive into the commentary, and especially if you dive into some of the commentators that really focus on language, like Zamakhshari and Al-Gharnati, and you start to see, whoa, that's actually really interesting. Then that is, that would be, so it was an ongoing process with the translation. But overall, after that, we really were digging into the commentary. So I'd probably say we spent 2/3 of the time on the commentary.
Were you surprised by the amount of criticism you received from Muslim quarters, and why didn't you include any South Asian tafsirs?
South Asian tafsirs, which ones do you have in mind?
Well, from what you already explained, because majority of the tafsir actually were from the 20th century.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have met your criteria.
Yeah.
I think that answers that question. But in terms of the criticism from Muslim quarters, were you surprised?
You know what I was surprised by? I was surprised that the book came out on like a Thursday, and on a Saturday, people were putting up screenshots of stuff. So obviously they hadn't read it in depth. What does that mean? That means that people had been waiting for this book to come out so that they could find passages that they could critique. So what I was really surprised by is, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by it, because it's interesting. I had a conversation with Hamza Yusuf after it came by, and I was like, look, nothing's perfect, but some of these people aren't even talking about the work that we did. And he said, yeah, welcome to the club. And he just said it comes with the territory. But so what I was surprised by in many instances was the lack of adab with some of the criticisms. I was surprised that people actually wrote there's actually a web page somewhere. I haven't looked at it for like 4 years, but there's a web page somewhere devoted to these horrible instance of the study Quran being written. And eventually they went out and they collected fatwas. And the fatwas are like, there is this book which says that all religions are one. And this is, what happens with Muslims reading that. I'm like, okay, well, I would actually say that that book is not in accord with Islamic thought as well. And whatever book it is that you're talking about, I'm not going to tell a Muslim they can't read whatever they want to read, but I'm going to tell them don't take your deen from that book. If we said all religions are one, yeah, you probably shouldn't read the study Quran, because that's not what we said, and it's not what the Quran says. That's for sure. But these types of misrepresentations that came out. I mean, I'll tell you somebody who really did a critique with adab, and I still don't agree with his points, but he did it with adab. It was Mobeen Vaid. Mobeen Vaid wrote like a 10-page review of the study Quran. He pointed out the things that he liked. He pointed out particular passages that he thought were problematic, and went into the classical texts and pointed out why he thought they were problematic. And I don't fully agree with his points. But I'll tell you one thing. He did it with complete adab and with ilm. And that is what I expect of scholars. And it surprised me when that is not what we got from some people for whom, before this had come out, I had quite a bit of regard.
Question from Hani Nassif, and Rizwan has got quite a few questions on esoteric using rationalist and traditions, commentaries. Hani Nassif, what was the approach of the study Quran dealing with anthropomorphic verses? What classical historical positions has the study Quran?
I can't hear you very well.
Okay,
Okay. What was the approach of study Quran in dealing with anthropomorphic verses?
Oh, anthropomorphic verses? Well, I mean, you'd have to read the passages there. That's where we actually discussed the different perspectives that exist regarding these verses, and some of the debates that have come into play over time, particularly debates between Mu'tazilis and Ash'aris regarding how we would interpret some of these verses. So those are ones that I personally, like, when it comes to anthropomorphic verses, I personally, again, like, having read through the tradition, they're problematic. They're difficult to deal with. And free will and predestination, I mean, that's problematic, man. That's difficult stuff to deal with. Nobody's really come up with a fully satisfactory answer to that in any religious tradition. Thank you very much. So we have different ways of explaining it. The Ash'arite explanation using Qasb is actually rather elegant in its own way. It's still not fully satisfactory. So these are the things that we tried to represent the debate around such positions and such verses.
Mm-hmm. How do you strike the correct balance between the use of esoteric and exoteric commentaries, likewise between rationalist and traditionalist commentaries?
This is a very good question. I don't know what you mean by rationalist and traditionalist. Al-Alusi brings out a really good point, which is that whenever you're talking about, people want to say that there's tafsir bil-ma'thur and tafsir bil-ray, right? So tafsir by what is actually transmitted. Well, guess what? You've got things from Ibn Abbas transmitted about verses that is like, dude, he didn't say all of that about that verse, and I know that. Rationally, I know that, all right? So tafsir bil-ma'thur, I've already got a limit here where what? I have to completely put aside my rational thinking in order to deal with this? So you've got places where you've got companions giving different opinions, and you've got a tabi'un giving different opinions. And as Al-Alusi brings out, you've actually got to use your discernment in order to just do tafsir bil-ma'thur in the first place. And so you have to admit that there's some aspect of your own intellectual intervention in the understanding just to be doing that in the first place. And so you know, but what we do is, one of the things is, for me personally, for example, Tabari was a go-to. I would kind of almost always want to see some of the things that Tabari had. And also, you know, you go to Suyuti Adur Manthur because he's really trying to go with the most sahih hadith. But then, you know, you've also got to realize that for the contemporary audience, just giving a tafsir bil ma'thur isn't going to work. And so you've really got to help people contextualize and understand some of these things. Now, when it gets to exoteric and esoteric, first of all, I think that that's not always the most useful distinction, because, you know, is it really esoteric to say that we need to purify the heart? Well, not really, but that's part of, you know, what people start to associate with, you know, tazkiyat al-nafs, tazkiyat al-qalb, and that is a place where some of the tafsirs that we would label as esoteric might focus more. So this is one of the things that you've really got to know when you're reading and you're trying to write this type of commentary that we wrote. You have to know which type of tafsir are going to be best for dealing with particular issues. So, for example, if I want to talk about the connections between surahs and ayat, you know, this is where Ibn Ajiba, al-Biqa'i are going to be more useful than a Tabari or al-Qurtubi, for example. If I want to talk about the, shall we say, inner meanings, or those verses of the Quran that are really talking about the human condition rather than laws, and they're talking about particular principles, sometimes that's where it's going to be much easier. I'm going to find much more in a particular Sufi tafsir. But you'd be surprised to find out how often some of the tafsir that we consider to be Sufi end up being in what we consider the mainline tradition. For example, Al-Qurtubi has many passages from Al-Qushayri's tafsir within his tafsir. And Fakhruddin Razi incorporates aspects of different, you know, kind of Sufi perspectives at times. And then later on, Al-Alusi has passages from the Futuhat al-Makkiyah in his tafsir. So it becomes incorporated in multiple different ways. And this is where that line isn't as hard and fast as we may sometimes imagine it to be.
Okay, so outside of the tradition, have you looked into using scientific perspective?
There's an essay on scientific tafsir in the back of the volume. I would recommend that one read that particular essay, because a lot of the issues is that people, there's a difference between science and there's a difference between scientism. And scientism is the belief that the methodologies behind science lead to a higher form of knowledge, or a more certain form of knowledge, and that therefore these particular methodologies are ones which we should, for some reason, be measuring the Quran against. And that's really not such a useful perspective. I mean, the Quran has never been against science in any way, shape, or form. I mean, one could even say that that verse in the Quran, which tells you to watch for the late afternoon prayer and to keep watch over it, I mean, there's even an argument you could make that that's the birth of algebra, because the whole process of having to actually calculate when Asr begins gets really complicated when you start taking account of the curvature of the earth. And so these are all types of scientific investigations that really, in many ways, the Quran was definitely encouraging. But that doesn't mean that one should limit one's perspective to those scientific tafsirs, because scientific methodology is just one rather actually small way of employing our intellect.
Okay, Professor, I know we've gone way beyond the time. I think Dr. Musharraf Hussain had a question. I couldn't see the question. Maybe we can put you there live. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Musharraf Hussain, a fellow translator of the Quran in plain English.
Yes,
Good
I'm
luck
very
to
honored
for
that
your
I'm
question.
intimidated as well.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Professor Lumbard, I want to commend you on this wonderful work. In fact, the whole team. What you've actually started is, I know, will be this new genre of tafsir. I think the old method of doing tafsir is really, I don't know whether anybody would want to do that kind of tafsir or read that kind of tafsir in 21st and beyond this. Actually, so I think what you've started is a wonderful work, and I really and I know your audience is a very particular audience, which is really students, graduates, possibly scholars. I have always actually worked with and amongst ordinary masses in the mosque as an imam and as a teacher for 40 years. So my aim has always been, how can we deliver the message of the Quran, which is a life-changing message, so that people can actually directly benefit from the Quran, not from the tafsir, not from the comments of the scholars, no, directly, how they can hear the voice of God there. How can they actually hear that voice loudly and clearly so that it really impacts them? For me, I've set that as my target for my translation and inshallah future work on the Quran. How do we make it? So have you got any tips on that?
You know, I mean, look, that is so difficult to say. I mean, as a person who you've spent a lifetime with the text and engaged with the text, I'm sure you've met some of these people who have a beautiful recitation of the Quran and a'udhu billah are incredibly arrogant about it. And you're like, wait a minute, you sit there working on this, reciting this, and for you, this is just an adornment of you. It's like, oh my God, how could that possibly be? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you this gift of incredibly beautiful recitation, and yet it's not penetrating your heart. So, you know, this question is difficult, because then there's a person who hears the adhan for the first time and is like, oh my God, what is that? And their entire life has changed from that moment forward. I don't know. Honestly, these are so, there's a magic in it that we as human beings don't have. Allahu yahdi man yasha bighayri hisab. God guides whom he wills with no account. I mean, there really isn't, you know, anything that we can account for in it. What can we do is reflect the Quran in our actions to the best of our abilities. And this is where, you know, I think that aspect of it is often lost. And so that integrating the Quran to become the walking Quran, rather than, you know, reciting it and such, and having that actually reflected in our adab and in our interactions with people, that is the best way. And then there are, of course, multiple ways in which our translations, our texts. This is one of the reasons why I'm trying to do this podcast now, is to bring out something that actually brings out some of that, you might say, more immediate, applicable lessons of certain verses of the Quran, I hope.
Thank you for that, Dr. Musharraf. It's really wonderful to read your majestic Quran. You have another similar initiative from America called the Clear Quran, which Dr. Mustafa Khattab has published. And he's also got editions of the Kids Clear Quran, and also a new edition called the Hibs edition, where traditional Hafiz of Quran who are not accustomed to reading translations of Quran, they are encouraged to also read the Quran simultaneously with the translation. So I hope when you produce your subsequent versions, inshallah, you'll also produce kids edition as well as edition for madrasa and Hibs graduates, inshallah. Brother Mizan, do we have time to take maybe one or two live before we close up? We've taken 5 too long from the professor.
I think it's only fair for the professor to go and have some dinner, his most awaited dinner.
No, I'm fine to look. There's some people who've sat here. I have to apologize to everyone because I can't really address the question and read the questions in the chat at the same time. So I'm really very sorry about that.
I think the best thing would be, Professor, you deserve dinner. You fasted all day, and you
all right,
spent
inshallah.
nearly over 1.5. And we're really privileged and honored to have Dr. Sheikh Musharraf Hussain as well, who also contributed beautifully. And you can see the noor in his face contributing as well, mashallah. I think we'll have to end. Abdullah, if you'd like to close up.
So we would like to thank Professor Lumbard. You've taken for your time. You've joined us straight after your iftar. We haven't given you much of a time, and we had the longest session with you so far amongst all the seminars, and we can go all night long. But hope, inshallah, we can continue to engage with yourself and learn from your new podcast and other such contributions. And I would like to thank all of you for your participation. You've been one of our largest crowds. Keep up the good work. Study the Quran, because it's something that we ought to study the month of the Quran. I myself have my journey through the Quran course running from this weekend. This is going to be the 13th consecutive year, so you can look at the Quran Study Group website. Otherwise, we thank you so much for all of you for your participation. We apologize we couldn't take any more questions, just sheer limitation of time. Thank you once again, Professor Lumbard, for your time in joining us. Jazakumullah khairan.
And just let me say, a few people here have asked me, can we talk privately? And more than one person has said, can we continue this privately? So, well, it's not my feed and we can't, and I'm not going to choose just one person. So I put my work email on the side there if you have another question that you want to follow up with. And one of my warnings to you is that when people ask me some questions, I often say, you need to read this article, and this article, and then ask me that question. Because oftentimes the question is wrong. And it's a matter of having a little bit more knowledge in order to ask the right question. So if you do email me, you might just get a reading list and not the direct answer you're hoping for. Oh, and somebody asked what the next surah is for the podcast. Surah Ash-Sharh will go up tomorrow, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair.
Allah yajzak khair.
Take care, sir. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
Thank you all very much. Assalamu alaikum.